Thank you. Appreciate it. Morning, everybody. Well, welcome to Food Northwest Process and Packaging Expo. I'm Mark Haas, CEO of D&H Technologies and the Helmsen Group. I'm your keynote speaker. I'm going to spend the next hour sharing 6 macro trends that I see converging on this industry at a speed and scale that none of us have encountered before in our careers. Each one of them individually is a billion-dollar inflection. Together, they represent something I believe is without precedent in modern history of food and beverage. But before I get to the trends, I want to start with a story, because the trends only make sense when you see what they look like inside of a facility. About 2.5 years ago, a client brought to us a project that should have been straightforward. A shelf-stable, high-protein dairy beverage. It was a good brief, clear target. Defined retail channel, the kind of development work that my agency works on every day, that we've executed hundreds of times across 500 brands. In more than 3 decades of formulation and process engineering, it was hard. High-protein, shelf-stable dairy is always hard. You're managing protein denaturation during thermal processing. You're fighting sedimentation over shelf life. You're balancing mouthfeel against protein load. And if you're doing it aseptically, which this was, every variable in your thermal profile interacts with every other variable in ways that require genuine process engineering, not just benchtop formulation. We had been working the project for about a year. The team was getting close. The emulsion was stabilizing. The sensory was landing. The thermal process was validated. Then the ground shifted. First, it was the consumer data. GLP-1 adoption was accelerating faster than anyone had projected, and the brand's target consumer is no longer just looking for protein. They wanted fiber. They wanted micronutrient density. They wanted smaller servings that did more. The brief that had been high-protein, shelf-stable dairy beverage became complete nutrition in 8 ounces that does not cause GI distress in someone whose appetite has been cut by a third. The fiber addition created a viscosity problem that cascaded into heat transfer, that cascaded into shelf life stability, and we had to re-engineer the thermal process. Then the regulatory environment shifted in ways nobody saw coming at that speed. The MAHA movement gained political traction faster than any policy initiative I've seen in my career. Suddenly, the FDA and USDA were jointly pursuing a federal definition of ultra-processed foods. Some of the functional ingredients we were using, ingredients that were doing real nutritional work in the formulation, were at risk of being classified as ultra-processed. Inputs, depending on which we define, emerged, on which definition emerged, we reformulated again. Then retailer standards changed. A major retailer partner flagged 2 ingredients as unacceptable under new supplier requirements that did not exist when we started the project. We reformulated again. Then tariffs re-escalated. A key ingredient landed cost jumped overnight. The margin model broke. We had to source alternatives and revalidate the EPR packaging. We had to revalidate alternatives and revalidate. The EPR packaging programs in 3 states created a compliance layer that required a packaging redesign, which required revalidating the thermal process for the new container format again. I stood in our pilot plant here in Portland, watching a talented team try to hold together a development project where the goalposts had shifted not once but 5 times in under 18 months. The original challenge was hard but solvable. What it had become was something else entirely, a product that had to satisfy GLP-1, nutritional demands, survive an undefined UPF regulatory framework, comply with retailer ingredient bans, and absorb tariff-driven cost shifts fit within a multi-state packaging compliance regime, all without changing the consumer price point. It was not incrementally harder. It felt at times impossible. If you're a processor, in this room, you have lived some version of that story in the last year. Projects where the brief did not change, but the world did. That experience forced me to rethink the talk I'm giving today, because what happened to that project is not a story about one difficult formulation. It is a story about 5 external forces converging on a single product at a single company at a speed nobody in this industry was prepared for. And each of those forces individually represents a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for whoever responds best. Together, they represent the most consequential transformation the industry has experienced since refrigeration. And there's a six-fourths. I have not mentioned yet one that is going to make the first five feel like a prelude. I'll get to it, but I need you to understand the first five before the sixth makes sense, because the sixth is not a separate trend. It's the accelerant that determines whether you capture the value the other five create or get crushed by their complexity. If you're not building for it, you're watching from the shore while the industry remakes itself without you. So here's the thesis. I'll say it plainly. 6 existential forces converging on the industry right now. Any one of them managed well would make manufacturers and brands billions of dollars. Together, they are reshaping who wins and who survives and who disappears. I'll walk through each one, and I'm going to pull back the curtain on AI in a way you've not heard before. Not the version about job loss, not the version about making movies or building apps, the version about transformational infrastructure that the leaders of the 3 most important AI companies on Earth believe will be civilization altering as early as 2028. The version I know because I'm building it. The companies in this room have about 36 months to position. After that, the window narrows dramatically. Let me start with the force that's already reshaping every category in this industry, whether you see it yet or not. Satiety. There's a number circulating in boardrooms and innovation briefs that most people are reading wrong. 12% of American adults are currently taking GLP-1, not have considered, not asked their doctor about, but currently taking. That is from a tracking poll fielded in November 2025. 18% have used at one point. Nearly 1 in 5 adults have experienced what these drugs do to appetite, to cravings, to what clinicians call food noise. That is roughly 30 million people who woke up this morning with a fundamentally different relationship to food than they had 18 months ago. The instinct in this industry has been to read that number as a headwind. Less appetite means less volume, means less revenue. If that's your read, I respectfully suggest you look at the biggest reformulation opportunity in a generation, and mistaking it for a threat is not the right perspective. I've been in food science, as mentioned, for 35 years. I've watched trends come and go: oat bran, keto, acai, collagen. Most of them follow the same life cycle. Media attention drives consumer awareness and trial. Ingredient suppliers scramble, and a wave of products hit the shelf and then slow fade back to baseline. GLP-1 is structurally different from every one of those cycles, and the reason is important to understand at a mechanistic level. After 3 decades in this work, I have learned to pay attention when the consensus positions and the evidence point in different directions. Right now, the consensus reads GLP-1 as a demand headwind. The evidence says it's a market being repriced. These drugs do not change what people think about food, they change what people's bodies do with food. Energy intake drops 16 to 39%, depending on the study and the compound. The neurological phenomena clinicians call food noise, that persistent background of signal craving and appetite that drives impulse purchasing and overconsumption gets turned down or turned off entirely. When you suppress appetite at the hormonal level, you do not get a consumer who's trying harder to resist the snack aisle. You get a consumer who walks past the snack aisle, because the biological signal that used to pull them in no longer fires. Cornell published the most rigorous look at real-world purchasing. In the Journal of Marketing Research, they tracked transaction-level data across 150,000 households, matched with survey data on GLP-1 adoption. Within 6 months of starting medication, households reduced grocery spending by an average of 5%. Higher income households, the ones we like to target in the food industry, dropped by more than 8%. Savory snack spending fell roughly 10%, and sweet bakery goods dropped 9%. Fast food and coffee shop spending dropped about 8%. These aren't opinion survey numbers. Those are the cash register numbers. And only 4 food categories showed spending increases. Kind of predictable. Nutrition bars, fresh fruit, yogurt, and meat-based snacks. Every category that grew is nutrient dense and protein forward. But here's where the conversation gets important for everyone in this room. GLP-1 consumers do not stop eating. They eat less and they eat differently. Appetite suppression creates selectivity. Every calorie has to earn its place. Products that deliver genuine nutritional value in a smaller format get rewarded. Products that rely on engineered palatability and large servings to justify their shelf price, they get punished. This is not a temporary behavioral shift driven by willpower or cultural messaging. This is a pharmacological mediated reallocation of food spending toward nutrient density. The processor who reads this as less volume, lower revenue, is reading it wrong. The processor who reads this as the most valuable reformulation wave in a generation is reading it right. Every product in every category is about to be reevaluated through the lens of nutrient density per bite and per dollar. That is not a headwind. That is a market being repriced. And the access accelerant that's going to steepen the adoption curve just landed. On February 24th, Novo Nordisk announced a 50% price cut of Wegovy and 35% for Ozempic effective January 2027. New list price $675 a month, down from $1350 for Wegovy. The Medicare negotiated price has also dropped to $274. Self-pay patients can already access both drugs for $349 per month through retail and telehealth channels. They had already launched a once-daily Wegovy pill on January 5th at $149 for the starting dose. Within 3 weeks, it had been prescribed to 170,000 people. By February, Novo disclosed more than 600,000 total prescriptions since launch. The Wegovy injections first month generated a fraction of that uptake. An oral form at a fraction of the injection cost pulled adoption at a rate that stunned even the analysts tracking the space. And the pipeline keeps compressing. Eli Lilly's Retatrutide, which targets 3 hormones including GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon, showed 29% average weight loss in phase 3 clinical trials, the highest of any GLP drug in development. Lilly could file for FDA approval as early as this year, and India's semaglutide patents expired in March, and generic manufacturers launched at prices as low as $8 per month. The pricing architecture that kept GLP-1s confined to affluent early adopters is being systematically dismantled. The clinical landscape is expanding well beyond weight loss. In August, the FDA approved Wegovy for MASH, a serious liver disease affecting roughly 6% of US adults. Research published this month demonstrates that semaglutide improves liver disease markers even in patients who do not lose significant weight. The indication pipeline now includes cardiovascular disease, peripheral artery disease, obstructive sleep apnea, and exploratory work in GLP-1 and neurodegenerative disorders. GLP drugs are no longer weight loss drugs that happen to have benefits. They're becoming a therapeutic platform, and every new indication widens the consumer base that eats differently because of them. A Stanford medicine study published April 10th added another dimension. Roughly 10% of the population carries genetic variants linked to what researchers are calling GLP-1 resistance, where the drugs may be less effective for blood sugar. That finding points towards precision medicine approaches that will further segment the consumer base and create even more demand for tailored nutritional products designed around specific metabolic profiles. Circana shows 23% of US households now have at least one member using GLP-1. By 2030, those households are projected to be 35%. This is not a niche consumer segment. This is the primary growth driver for the entire category. The early industry response has been mostly cosmetic. Put a high protein claim on there, add a GLP-1 friendly badge, reduce the serving size, and call it portion controlled. It's not going to work. A GLP-1 consumer eating 30% less needs more nutritional density per serving, not just smaller servings. They need adequate protein to preserve lean mass during weight loss. They need fiber because constipation and GI side effects are among the most prominent complaints on these drugs. They need micronutrient support because reduced food intake means reduced micronutrient intake unless the products they choose are deliberately designed to compensate. Solving that on a label is easy. Solving it in a process where most of the industry is about to get stuck. Every one of these nutritional requirements creates a downstream engineering problem that compounds through the manufacturing system. More protein in a smaller serving sounds simple until you try to put 10 pounds of performance in a 5-pound bag. In fluid systems, the viscosity changes every downstream process parameter, shifts with it. In a bar, the matrix will not hold its shape. A cracker crumbles and falls apart. The physical properties of the product change fundamentally. When you increase nutrient density in the processing, the packaging, the shelf life, and the regulatory pathway all change with them. I spent 35 years inside that cascade across more than 500 brands, and what looks like a formulation adjustment on a bench becomes a full process revalidation on a production line. And fiber, and when you introduce fiber, you introduce particle behavior and instability and different problems that do not surface during development. They surface at month 4 of shelf life when your product is already on the shelf. Increasing the micronutrient density and open oxidation pathways that degrade flavor and color across distribution, reduce sugar, and you enter a sweetener landscape where the consensus position, the evidence are pointing in different directions. Erythritol carries the natural designation and has become ubiquitous in better for you formulations, but now cardiovascular research from Cleveland Clinic found elevated blood erythritol levels associated with approximately double the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events. The populations most likely to consume erythritol sweetened products are precisely the populations at highest baseline cardiovascular risk. Meanwhile, allulose, which has no comparable cardiovascular signal and causes minimal GI distress, cannot get shelf space at the retailers that most loudly proclaim their commitment to ingredient quality. The formulator solving the GLP-1 product brief is navigating all of this simultaneously. Protein denaturation and fiber viscosity and sweetener safety signals and natural color stability and regulatory classification across jurisdictions. Each solution constrains the other. Each variable interacts with every other variable in the process. And all of this has to be accomplished without tripping the ultra-processed food definitions that are simultaneously tightening across federal and state regulatory frameworks and retail procurement standards. This isn't a marketing exercise. This is a technical problem that requires genuine food science and process engineering to solve. The brands that invest in the capability or partner with people who have it will own the most valuable consumer segment in the industry. The brands that treat this as a packaging refresh will watch the segment walk past their products. The question is not whether satiety economy is coming, it's here. The question is whether your products are designed to win in it. So that is the demand signal. 30 million consumers eating differently, a market being repriced through nutrient density. Now I'll show you the processing platform that makes demand capturable at scale. So the first one, ultra-filtered dairy. The first reformulation instinct in response to GLP-1 has been protein. And that is correct. 70% of Americans already say they try to consume protein. When you're eating 30% less, preserving lean mass becomes urgent. A survey confirmed what the market already knew. Protein is a nutrient consumers prioritize above all others. But putting high protein on a front panel is not the same thing as solving protein at a process level. And the technology that turns protein from a label number into a scalable processing platform is ultrafiltration, at least one of them. I've spent decades working with dairy processing systems. I have validated aseptic lines, and I designed thermal processes and commissioned facilities that some of the people in this room have run product through. I'm one of 7 process authorities in the country recognized by the AFDO for aseptic system validation. And when I tell you ultrafiltered milk is not a product trend but a platform technology, I'm speaking from inside the industry. Ultrafiltration solves multiple constraints simultaneously in a GLP-1 world. More protein per serving, less sugar, less lactose, superior texture compared to adding protein powders into a beverage base, and accomplishes all of this through membrane fractionation. Separating milk into its molecular components and recombining them in proportions that do not occur in nature is a process that is inherently scalable, increasingly well understood from food safety and quality perspective, but it's also a process that will matter enormously when we get to the definition war. Because fractionation and recombination is exactly what emerging UPF, ultra-processed food, frameworks target. The investment signals are unambiguous. Coca-Cola committed $650 million to a new Fairlife production facility in Webster, New York. That is not a test kitchen. That is a bet on processing platform. Michigan milk producers Association expanded specifically to increase ultrafiltered capacity. CoBank analysis citing Circana data shows ready-to-drink dairy protein beverages grew roughly 71% over 4 years to about $8 billion in total sales. It's $8 billion in sales in a category that barely existed 15 years ago. And the competitive moat around the early movers is eroding. Early milk fractionation patent families originating in the early 2000s and later assigned to Fairlife are listed as expired. The foundational IP around component separation is no longer a barrier to entry, even as newer patents around specific processes and systems continue to be filed. This matters because it increases the likelihood of rapid capacity expansion across the supply base. Multiple ingredient suppliers building ultrafiltered milk capability, multiple co-manufacturers adding membrane systems, private label following fast. For processors, this is a platform investment, not a dairy bet. Once you have membrane separation expertise, once you understand fouling and CIP validation, and yield optimization, and QA around protein, that capability seeds adjacent innovations across the portfolio. High protein cultured products, coffee protein blends, low sugar dairy desserts, hybrid protein fiber beverages. I validated an aseptic facility where the client was bringing online innovative Tetra Pak BTIS processing technology. I did that in December. And a system that had never been commissioned at the scale in the United States. I can't get into the specifics, but that technology doesn't exist anywhere in the Americas. The reason they made that investment was not one product, it was a recognition that the processing platform itself would enable a portfolio of products across multiple categories and channels. And that is platform thinking that wins. I can tell you that facility, 2 months after its launch, is now fully capacitized. But protein alone is not the architecture. The moment you try to pair protein with fiber, which is exactly what the GLP-1 consumer demands, you introduce a second set of engineering challenges most of the industry has not solved. Fiber is where the story gets both exciting and complicated. Because fiber is not just a formulation challenge, it's a regulatory minefield that connects directly to the next two forces I need to describe. Fiber renaissance. Americans trying to consume fiber rose 64% in 2025, up from 56% in 2021. That's a meaningful shift in macronutrient that the industry has struggled to make exciting for decades, and the reason shifted because of GLP-1. GLP-1 users need fiber, not in the vague fiber is good for you sense. That has been repeated on cereal boxes since the 80s. They need fiber because constipation and GI side effects are among the most prominent complaints on these drugs. Do not skip fiber. Just because you're eating less has become a standard diet guidance for anyone on a semi-glutide diet. The nutrient rationale for fiber fortification has never been stronger, and the consumer motivation has never been more immediate. But here's where most of the industry conversion gets superficial. Not all fiber is created equal, and the two paths that industry is pursuing create very different manufacturing challenges, very different regulatory exposures, and very different competitive positions. The first path I call credible fiber, upcycled, less refined plant fibers, apple pomace, grape pomace, fruit and vegetable hulls. Sustainability story is powerful, circular economy, waste valorization, real food identity. The nutritional profile can be impressive. Peer-reviewed work shows some pomace ingredients delivering 30 to 60% fiber along with polyphenols, and the consumer story is legible. A label that says apple fiber communicates something a consumer can understand and trust. But the people in this room know the problem. Texture, particle size, water binding, insoluble fractions that change mouthfeel and rheology in ways that make formulators lose sleep. I have watched teams spend months trying to get pomace-based fiber to behave in a beverage system, and the answer always comes back to the same place: particle engineering. Studies on byproduct grinding and particle size demonstrate that milling choices alone can create meaningful functional shifts in water holding capacity and viscosity and sensory perception. Most ingredient suppliers have not solved that at scale. The ones who do will own a valuable position because credible fiber is exactly what survives the definition war. Second path is what I call invisible fiber. Low viscosity, heat stable, pH stable fibers like resistant maltodextrins and soluble corn fiber derivatives These are the workhorses of fiber fortification because they do not fight the product. You can add them to beverages, bars, cultured dairy, frozen products, and the consumer does not notice. The formulation flexibility is enormous, and that flexibility is why they are everywhere. But invisible fibers carry a different risk. They're exactly the kind of ingredient that gets caught in the crossfire of the ultra-processed food debate. They are, by most classification systems, highly processed ingredients, substances derived from food through a series of industrial processes and recombined into a form that bears no resemblance to the source material. The NOVA framework would place them squarely in Group 4. And as the definition war heats up, products relying heavily on invisible fibers for their nutritional claims may find those claims harder to defend in a regulatory and retail environment that is moving against anything perceived as ultra-processed. There's a third category, because it illustrates the technical complexity that hides behind simple label claims. Short-chain fructooligosaccharides are widely used prebiotic fibers, but multiple studies show they can be susceptible to hydrolysis and degradation under low pH and thermal processing, especially in acidic beverage environments. That means shelf life sugar creep. That means sweetness changes over distribution. That means a product that tested clean at month 0 may not test clean at month 6. And if your quality system is not catching that, your label claim is drifting, and your litigation exposure is growing. The strategic frame for processors is this: fiber wave will not be won by whoever can add the most grams on a label. It will be won by whoever solves organoleptics and stability at scale. Particle engineering or credible fibers, smart deployment for invisible fibers with clear-eyed understanding of their ultra-process exposure, and rigorous stability protocols for functional fibers that behave differently under real-world processing and storage conditions than they do on a specification sheet. Danone has already launched protein shakes with meaningful fiber, explicitly citing GLP-1. This is not a test. That is a category signal. Protein plus fiber architecture is coming to every shelf because it is legible to consumers and easy for retailers to merchandise. The processor who owns the technology to deliver the architecture at scale with stability and with ingredients that survive regulatory scrutiny captures value across every category fiber touches. And that the formulator solving fiber is simultaneously solving sweetener systems and color systems and preservation systems in the same product. The consensus position on sweeteners is itself unstable. Erythritol carries cardiovascular research signals. We talked about that. Allulose has the cleaner safety profile but cannot get shelf space at retailers that most loudly proclaim their commitment to ingredient quality. And the gap between what the evidence shows and what the market currently accepts is where both risk and opportunity live. The processor navigating fiber is navigating that same gap across every functional ingredient category simultaneously. That compounding complexity is why I keep coming back to convergence. These are not 5 separate problems. They are one problem with 5 different faces. And the face is going to determine whether the other 4 are solvable or not, is the definition war, because if the definitions get written wrong, some of the best tools you have to solve GLP-1 reformulation challenge become regulatory liabilities overnight. At the heart of the ultra-processed food debate lies a fundamental conflation, the assumption that processing itself is the pathology. The NOVA classification system, which underpins most ultra-processed food research, in which the FDA and USDA are now using as a reference point in their joint effort to develop a uniform federal definition, categorizes foods by the extent and purpose of processing. It places ultra-processed foods in the most concerning tier. But this framework commits a category error that food scientists have been pointing out for years. A good friend of mine, Joe Bubink, at the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota, has articulated this distinction with peer-reviewed research. He and I agree on a different outcome, a different perspective, and how we look at this. We've written Obesity Science and Practice, and Bubink co-authored with Alan Levine, argue that in most cases, it is the formulation more than the processing that results in foods that are not recommended as part of a healthy diet. They propose that we should be talking about ultra-formulated foods, products engineered with high levels of added sugars, refined carbohydrates, saturated fats, and sodium, rather than conflating them with foods that have simply undergone intensive processing. This isn't semantic hair splitting. It's the difference between coherent policy and regulatory theater. Consider this. An apple transformed in unsweetened applesauce, the processing involved is significant. The apple is washed, peeled, cored, cooked, pureed. Some heat-sensitive nutrients are lost. Enzymes are denatured. By many classification scheme, this registers as highly processed. Yet, nutritionally, unsweetened applesauce remains remarkably close to the source material. Same apple, transformed for preservation and distribution. Now add sugar, add high fructose corn syrup, add artificial colors and flavors. The processing hasn't changed, but the formulation has, and that formulation is what makes the product problematic for human health. But the NOVA system fails to adequately distinguish between these two products, and that failure is about to propagate into policy. Even if we could agree on a coherent definition, which we cannot, given the current state of classification science, we would face another problem the emerging policy consensus does not address. Any classification system will be gamed. It's what I do. It's how I make my living. Food manufacturers are sophisticated formulators. They employ food scientists, whose regulatory specialists, whose job is to optimize products for market success within whatever constraints regulators impose. If a classification system defines a product as Class 4, but a minor reformulation can achieve Class 2, we'll reformulate. They will do so not because Class 2 is better, but because it sells more than Class 4. The result is products that appear healthier by classification while remaining problematic by formulation. This isn't speculation. It's a predictable outcome of every nutrient-based classification system that has been implemented to date. We've all seen it. We've all experienced it. Low fat. Products proliferated in the 1990s, often replacing fat with sugar to maintain palatability. No added sugar. Products substitute artificial sweeteners that may carry their own metabolic concerns. Classification systems create targets. Formulators hit targets. Consumer health does not necessarily improve, and policy is moving fast. On July 25, 2025, the FDA and USDA jointly published a request for information seeking data to develop a uniform definition of ultra-processed foods for the U.S. food supply. The comment period extended once because of the complexity of the question, closed in October. FDA has not yet published a proposed rule, but the machinery is in motion and the political will behind it is bipartisan in a way that almost nothing in food policy has been in decades. Secretary Kennedy has called ultra-processed foods the driver of the chronic disease epidemic. At the Republican Attorney General Association meeting in September, he explicitly encouraged State Attorney General to treat UPF marketing the way they treated tobacco. It's not subtle. That is a sitting cabinet secretary comparing your products to cigarettes and telling the state enforcement apparatus to act accordingly. 84 advocacy organizations sent a joint letter to Congress urging stronger UPF regulation. The Maha Commission report released in May 25 estimated that approximately 70% of packaged goods in the United States food supply would be classified as ultra-processed, and that children get more than 60% of their calories from such foods. The states aren't waiting. Arizona enacted the Healthy School Act in April 25, banning foods with 11 specific additives from school campuses starting in the 26-27 school year. California signed the Real Healthy Food Kids Act in October. West Virginia banned 7 synthetic dyes. Texas passed warning label requirements for products containing any of 50 listed ingredients. And about 30 states have proposed or passed legislation targeting artificial colors. And here's the nuance almost nobody in the current conversation is addressing, and it matters enormously for processors in this room who are reformulating right now. Under federal regulation, 21 CFR 101.22A4, the term artificial color means any color additive. Any. Not just synthetic, not just petroleum-based, any color additive. And under 21 CFR Part 73, fruit juice and vegetable juice, when used for the purpose of coloring food, are classified as color additives. They are exempt from batch certification, but they are still color additives, which means under federal regulatory definition, they are still technically artificial colors. Hold that for a minute. The beet juice you're using to make your product pink is a color additive under federal law. The turmeric giving your bar its yellow is a color additive. The fruit juice concentrate giving your gummy its color is a color additive. Every one of them is technically artificial under the regulation as written. The FDA acknowledged this problem in February. when they issued enforcement discretion on no artificial colors. Their solution was not to change the regulation, okay? It was to say they will not enforce against no artificial colors, as long as the product does not contain certified petroleum-based colors. But enforcement discretion is not a rule change. It's a policy position. It could be reversed, and critically, it does not bind state courts or private litigants. The state laws being promulgated right now, Arizona, California, West Virginia, Texas, are targeting specific named synthetic dyes. They are not written with the nuance of the FDA's two-tier color additive system, but the broader artificial color being used in retail procurement standards and consumer-facing marketing claims, which create a gap. A product reformulated with fruit juice concentrate as a colorant could be challenged under a no artificial colors claim if a plaintiff attorney applies the federal regulatory definition rather than the FDA's enforcement discretion position. At least 50 putative class actions have been filed in the last 5 years challenging no artificial color. The FDA's enforcement discretion provides helpful context for the defense, but it does not close the exposure. The regulatory definition has not changed. The litigation surface remains open. And this is the kind of regulatory imprecision that creates both compliance risk and opportunity simultaneously. The processors and brands who understand the distinction between certified exempt from certification color additives, who document their sourcing and their functional intent, who can demonstrate that their color choices align with both the letter and the spirit of the law, they are insulated, maybe. The ones who assume that switching from red 40 to beet juice solves the problem without understanding the regulatory architecture underneath they're building on sand. And retailers are becoming regulators faster than the regulatory agencies themselves. When Target gives cereal makers 90 days to reformulate or lose shelf space, that is not a marketing preference. That is a procurement event that cascades through your formulation team and your ingredient suppliers and your color house and your stability testing and your label compliance and your production scheduling and your color alternatives that may not behave the same way under heat. Your stability data needs to be regenerated. Your thermal process may need adjustment. Your label needs legal review. Target announced on February 27th that it will require every cereal it sells to be free of certified synthetic colors by the end of May. 85% of its cereal sales already come from products without synthetic dyes, but that remaining 15% now has roughly 90 days to reformulate or lose shelf space. Walmart announced in October it will remove synthetic dyes, 30 other ingredients from about 1,000 store brand products. General Mills is pulling synthetic colors from all U.S. cereals. By this summer, Kraft Heinz is removing all FD&C colors by the end of 27. FDA published a public tracker of industry pledges to eliminate 6 remaining certified synthetic dyes by the end of 27. Here's the paradox at the center of all this, and it is the thing I most want this room to internalize. Processing is not the enemy. Processing is what makes food safe. Processing is what makes food affordable. Processing is what enables shelf stability and distribution and fortification and access. Ultra-filtered milk I just spent time talking about and celebrating. The fiber fortification that GLP-1 consumers desperately need require processed ingredients. The natural color replacements retailers are demanding involve extraction processes every bit as industrial as the synthetic dyes. Processing has always been about preservation and shelf stability and safety and access. Drying, salting, smoking, fermenting, pickling. Every culture on earth developed processing techniques because the alternative was starvation during seasons when fresh food was not available. The Industrial Revolution did not invent food processing. We scaled it. The issue was never processing. The issue is ultra-formulation. Combinations of nutrient absence and engineering inputs where the processing exists to create consumer appeal at the expense of nutritional substance. But the regulatory apparatus cannot make this distinction because the definitions are not precise enough, and that imprecision is both a risk and enormous opportunity. The risk is that products which are genuinely nutritious could be classified as ultra-processed. The opportunity is that companies who design products and processes survive in plausible definition any plausible definition, where every ingredient answers the question, what does this do for the person eating it? Own the most defensible market position in the industry. That is not a compliance exercise, that is a multi-billion-dollar competitive moat. So you have a market being repriced by GLP-1, you have platform technologies to capture that market, You have a fiber challenge that connects formulation to regulation. You have a definition war that determines which ingredients survive. And now I need to talk about the forces that are invisible to the consumer, but that hit your P&L directly. And I need to talk about the force that makes up all 5 of these feel like a warm-up. These forces reshaping process or P&Ls that consumers never see. The first force I described are visible to anyone paying attention. What I'm about to describe is invisible until it compounds through your value chain and shows up at shelf price your customer did not budget for. California's SB 54 is the anchor. Starting in 2027, the Producer Responsibility Organization collects $500 million per year from CPG companies, up to $150 million additionally from plastic resin manufacturers, $5 billion total over 10 years flowing out of the industry to fund plastic pollution mitigation. Colorado launched producer responsibility dues in January of this year. Oregon, reporting deadlines hit May 26, enabling fee setting for subsequent program years. Maine's program launches in 27. Washington passed an EPR bill in 25 and is already rulemaking. 5 programs heading toward 10, each with different definitions, different fee structures, different reporting requirements, different timelines. The initial reaction is always the same. It's a small percentage of your COGS. And at the processor level, that is true, but follow the compounding math downstream. If your cost goes up by 1.25% from EPR fees and your brand customer prices off your cost at their target gross margin, and the distributor marks up that retailer, that 1.25% does not stay 1.25%. It compounds through the value chain. And in many categories, a modest upstream cost becomes a multi-point shelf price shift. The processor who builds the data infrastructure to track packaging attributes at the SKU level and optimize material choices against eco-modulated fee tiers turns this into a margin advantage. The processor who does not absorbs it. Concurrent tariff volatility amplifies the pressure. Recent re-escalation created temporary global import surcharges. Even time-limited measures create rush behavior, pull forward ordering, inventory strategy disruption, freight chaos, all of which cascade for months after the announcement itself. USDA economic analysis of the 2018-2019 tariff round estimated retaliatory tariffs reduced U.S. agricultural exports by more than 27 billion. And that playbook is being run again. For processors, tariffs and EPR and reformulation pressure interact as a system. A tariff changes ingredient economics, forcing a sourcing change. The sourcing change may alter formulation, which changes the packaging requirements, so it changes the EPR fee exposure, which shifts the substrate choice, which may require thermal processing revalidation for certain packaged products. These aren't separate problems to be solved in separate departments. They are cascading variables in a single optimization problem. And then there is litigation. This is not a compliance crisis, it's a business model. And unless you understand how it works, your company is next. Class action filings against CPG companies hit close to 300 lawsuits in 24, nearly an all-time high, and the attack surface keeps expanding. Natural, we've seen those. Protein is now the new target. Packaging fill levels, sustainability assertions, and now ultra-processed food is legal theory. The pattern is visible across alternative protein sector. Between September and June of last year, at least 5 major alternative protein companies faced class actions over protein labeling. Beyond Meat settled for $7.5 million. The allegations follow an identical template. Front-of-pack protein content claims without corresponding PDCAS, corrected daily value percentages. In the nutrition facts panel, plaintiff attorneys identified a lucrative gap between what FDA requires and what courts will certify as a class action. They are pursuing these cases because regulatory ambiguity creates enough uncertainty that companies will pay to avoid the risk. Economics are brutal, and for a venture-backed company, spending $1.5 million on legal fees is reasonable. No. Spending $1.5 million in legal defense, even when your interpretation is reasonable, can be existentially threatening. Settlement becomes a rational choice. The plaintiff attorney knows this, and so San Francisco also filed a lawsuit against major food manufacturers, framing ultra-processed foods as a public nuisance and a deceptive marketing issue. That is not a labeling claim dispute. That is an attempt to establish UPF itself as a cause of action. Mondelez settled 100% whole grain labeling for $10 million and agreed modifying labels on wheat thins. That is economic economics of modern food litigation, even a settlement that seems manageable in isolation forces label changes, which force reformulation reviews, which cascade into production line adjustments. For the emerging brands many processors serve as co-manufacturers, the calculus is brutal. Settlement economics drain working capital, distract leadership, trigger exactly the kind of rapid cycle reformulation that causes quality failures, and if the process engineering is not right, other issues happen. So what does this mean practically? Your customers are going to demand faster reformulation, cleaner substantiation files, they're going to shift manufacturing partners based on who can move fastest without causing failures, and that's not a prediction. And that's what I'm seeing right now. So 5 forces, each one capable of generating billions for whoever moves first. GLP-1 repricing every product through nutrient density, platform technologies enabling new categories, a fiber challenge connecting formulation to regulation, a definition war determining which ingredients survive, hidden cost structures compounding through value change where litigation accelerates reformulation beyond human planning horizons. Any one of these managed well makes you billions. Together, they create a combinatorial complexity problem that no human team can optimize across simultaneously at the speed that this market now demands. Which brings me to the force I promised, the one that makes the first 5 feel like a prelude. Something has shifted. Processing has changed, manufacturing has changed, capital flows have changed, data availability has changed, regulatory complexity has changed, but we're still using tools built for a simpler era, and then acting surprised when nothing seems to move fast enough. Consider what manual compliance actually looks like in a food manufacturing facility. A mid-sized manufacturer using 50 ingredients across 20 products manages roughly 5,000 pages of documentation of primary compliance. Each ingredient requires more than 100 pages of certification, attestations, specifications. These documents expire on staggered schedules, certificates of analysis, organic and kosher, halal certifications are annual. And when any document updates, changes must cascade through every affected formulation, label and customer specification, and now add the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, state regulations, Prop 65, customer certifications, the EPR reporting, which I mentioned earlier, and now the UPF definitional complexity, which is not defined yet. We don't know what that is and who's handling it. Humans managing these systems are talented and dedicated, and they are drowning. That is the state of the industry right now. Spreadsheets, PDFs, phone calls, manual cross-referencing across jurisdictions that change quarterly. Most AI talks at food industry conferences are one of 3 things. The fear talk, AI is coming for your jobs. The toy talk, look at this cool picture I generated with AI. The dashboard talk, here's how I can manipulate your data and show you how to run your business better. I'm not doing that. I'm going to talk about AI as transformational infrastructure. Infrastructure is so powerful that its absence becomes a competitive determinant. And I'm going to talk about it not as an observer reading articles about what Silicon Valley says is coming, but as someone who's building this technology, who partners with the companies driving it, and who competes in the arena where the future of this capability is being decided. 6 years ago, I started building an AI-powered compliance infrastructure platform for food and beverage. We're credible. We have backers with NVIDIA, Microsoft, AWS. We have deep technology partnerships that put us inside their ecosystems, where we see what is being built, where the capability trajectory is heading before it reaches the market. When you're inside the NVIDIA ecosystem, you see the compute infrastructure being assembled for the next generation of AI models. When you build on Microsoft Azure, you see the industry-specific agents being deployed. Food and beverage manufacturing models is already shipping. Demand planning AI that companies like Domino's are running in production. When you are in the AWS ecosystem, you see the enterprise infrastructure being built for every vertical. So when I tell you, I'm about to tell you, understand that comes from inside the machine, not from reading about it. On February 24th, Dario Amodei sat down with Nikhil Kamath in Bangalore for the People with WTF podcast. Amodei is the CEO of Anthropic, Claude, if you don't know. He co-authored the original research on AI scaling laws. He's one of perhaps 3 people in the world who has the deepest view of where this technology is and where it's going. He described the current trajectory as a tsunami. People can see it on the horizon, he said, but they are still convincing themselves it's the trick of the light. He said he believes we could have AI models equivalent to a country of geniuses in the data center within 1 to 2 years. In a separate interview that same month, Amadeus said something that should keep every CEO in every industry awake. He was asked why Anthropic does not spend more aggressively given the scale of what is coming. His answer? What if the country of geniuses comes, but it comes in 28 instead of 27? You go bankrupt. They're strapped for cash right now, but they're not stopping. The margin for error in timing is that thin, even for the people building the thing. 1 week later, Sam Altman stood on a stage at India AI Impact Summit and predicted that by the end of 28, more of the world's intellectual capacity could reside inside data centers than outside of them. He described the cost of AI capabilities falling tenfold every 12 months. So Moore's law multiplied. This is 10 times every 12 months. Moore's law used to be double every 18 to 24 months. Microsoft projects 1.3 billion AI agents in operation by 28, not chatbots, agents. Autonomous systems that execute tasks and coordinate across functions and optimize operations without continuous human intervention. So performing routine tasks. So what does this mean for this industry? Not abstractly, but concretely. The 5 forces I described create a problem that in its essence is a combinatorial complexity problem. You cannot solve GLP-1 reformulation in isolation from UPF. You cannot solve UPF in isolation from retailer standards. You cannot solve retailer standards in isolation from EPR packaging. And you can't solve EPR in isolation from tariff volatility. And you cannot solve any of it in isolation from litigation risk. The number of variables and the speed at which they change and the way they interact across jurisdictions and categories and channels creates a problem space that exceeds human cognitive bandwidth. I'm not saying to diminish anyone in this room. I say it because it's a mathematical reality. The food and beverage regulatory landscape now spans dozens of federal and state jurisdictions with different and sometimes contradictory definitions and timelines. The ingredient landscape is being reshaped by retailer policies that change quarterly. The cost landscape shifts with every tariff announcement. The litigation landscape evolves with every filing. No team, no matter how talented, can optimize across all of these dimensions simultaneously at the speed this market now demands, with the accuracy that compliance requires. But AI can. Not AI as a chatbot that answers questions, not AI as a dashboard that visualizes data, not AI as a novelty that writes your marketing copy. AI as infrastructure that ingests regulatory databases across every relevant jurisdiction in real time, that monitors policy changes, that cross-references formulation data against the evolving compliance requirements, that flags risks before they become violations, that generates reformulation candidates satisfying multiple constraint sets simultaneously, that compresses development cycles from months to weeks. Integration, that's why we built what we built. An integration into food science and curricula at various academic institutions. We're part of the curriculum structure at Cal Poly and OSU, now University of Georgia, moving into the University of Minnesota. We've been getting a lot of traction, and there's a great deal of interest in what we're doing. But I want to be honest about something, because intellectual honesty is what separates credible AI deployment from hype. AI is very good at finding patterns in whatever data you feed it. It's not good at telling you where that data stops being reliable. When models train on incomplete or biased or proxy data sets, they do not slow down. They speed up, they get more confident. That's how you end up with formulations that are statistically optimized but biologically ambiguous, carrying claims that sound precise but rest on dead evidence. This is the hallucination thing you've heard about on OpenAI and other platforms. The gap between computational speed and scientific certainty is not a future problem, it's a present one, which is why AI infrastructure without domain expertise is dangerous, and domain expertise without AI infrastructure is too slow. You need both. AI handles the combinatorial complexity across jurisdictions and ingredient databases and regulatory timelines. The food scientist and process engineer and the regulatory specialist handle the judgment calls. The AI cannot make those judgment calls. The question is not AI or humans. The question is whether you have the infrastructure that lets your humans operate at the speed the market now demands. I want to go beyond my own platform and tell you what I see coming from inside the ecosystem. Within 24 months, AI agents will take a reformulation brief, a brief that says remove these ingredients, increase protein to this level, add this much fiber, maintain the sensory profile, comply with regulations in these 12 states, fit with an EPR, generate a candidate formulation, and with stability predictions and cost models and compliance assessments in hours. Not weeks, not months, hours. Within 36 months, those agents will be connected to manufacturing execution systems, quality management platforms, and supply chain networks, creating closed-loop optimization that adjusts formulations and processes in near real time. As regulations change and ingredients shift and demand signals evolve, the food manufacturers deploying AI quality control today are now reporting 15 to 30% better defect detection. Plants running AI predictive maintenance are reducing unplanned downtime. Those are not projections. Those are production numbers from current deployments. Now multiply that by the 5 forces we discussed. AI does not just help you respond to each force individually, it helps you optimize across all 5 simultaneously. It turns a combinatorial complexity problem into a solvable optimization problem and compresses the timeline from we will get there in 3 years to we shipped the reformulation last quarter. Here's what I'd like you to understand. This is the part that's different from every other AI conversation you've had. The gap between companies that build AI infrastructure into their core and companies that do not is about to become unbridgeable. Not large, not significant, but actually unbridgeable. Because AI capability compounds the company that integrates AI into formulation and compliance and quality and supply chain today. We have 18 months of learning and data accumulation workflow optimization that a late mover cannot replicate by purchasing the same software in 28. The models are trained on your data, agents are tuned to your processes, the institutional knowledge is embedded in the system, and you can't purchase that knowledge. Here's the implication that nobody at a food conference has said directly. If the largest strategic food companies adopt AI infrastructure at scale and the rest of the industry does not, the resulting efficiency gap and speed gap and compliance gap creates conditions where the economics of competing become untenable, when one company reformulates in weeks and another takes months, when one company tracks compliance across 50 state-level programs in real time and another uses spreadsheets, when one company optimizes packaging costs across EPR tiers automatically and another is guessing, the unit economics diverge to a point where the slower companies simply cannot compete on cost or speed or accuracy. The gap is open right now, but it's widening every month. Every era of transformation in this industry has produced a new class of winners. Refrigeration created companies that dominated for a century. Aseptic processing created categories worth billions. The food safety revolution created competitive moats that hold today. And the 6 forces converging right now will do the same. They'll create a new class of companies that dominate because they move fast, built the right capabilities, and use tools to operate at a speed and precision their competitors could not match. The satiety economy is repricing every product in every category. 30 million consumers have already changed how they eat. The pricing and access barriers that limited adoption are falling. The oral formats that remove the psychological friction of injection are here. The generics that will drive global accessibility are launching. The platform technologies are enabling product systems worth billions. Membrane filtration, aseptic processing are not dairy trends. They're enabling infrastructure for the next generation of nutrient-dense products across categories. The fiber renaissance is creating technology race that will be won by whoever adds the most grams on a label, but whoever solves the sensory and stability challenges at scale. The definition war is creating regulatory moats for the prepared and existential exposure for the complacent. The distinction between processing formulation is not academic. It is the difference between a defensible market position and a classification target. The hidden taxes are compounding through value chains and the litigation economy is accelerating. And AI, the 6th force, is the multiplier that determines whether you capture the value the other 5 create or get crushed by their complexity. Dario Amodei sat in Bangalore on February 24th and said the tsunami is visible on the horizon. Sam Altman stood in India and said, more intellectual capacity could live inside data centers than outside of them. Microsoft projects 1.3 billion AI agents in operation by the end of 28. And I'm telling you from inside this industry and from inside the ecosystem that the gap between the companies that build AI infrastructure into their operations now and companies that wait is about to become permanent. Not large, not concerning, but permanent. I have never seen anything like what is coming. Not the forces alone. Forces always arrive. But the convergence, the simultaneity of the accelerant that this all represents. The companies that are ready will not just navigate this transformation, they'll capture generational value from it. The window's open, but it won't be long. And the question every person in this room needs to answer before they get on their flight home is not, should we do something? The question is, are we moving fast enough?